this video, we will discuss the context of the general letters of the New Testament. This is part 2 of a two-part video. In the previous video, we discussed the letters of Jude and James, and in this video we will be discussing 1st and 2nd Peter. Like the rest of the text in the New Testament, we must first begin by asking who wrote this first epistle of Peter. Of course, the text is attributed to Peter, one of Jesus' 12 disciples. However, many modern scholars notice a few difficulties with attributing this text to Peter the Apostle. The first of these is that Peter died probably by the year 68 CE. Lever, Domitian persecuted Christians around 81 CE, which is 10 to 12 years after Peter's death at least. Domitian's persecution of Christians seems to be in the background of the text that we see in 1 Peter, although some argue that instead this was Nero's persecution, which happened much earlier, and would have happened during Peter's lifetime. In addition, the language that we see in the first epistle of Peter is much too advanced for a simple fisherman from Galilee. This is similar to what we saw in the epistle of James. A person who was a fisherman, who was from Galilee, who was not well educated, would not be able to write in these advanced ways. Some scholars claim that Silvanus, who is mentioned in the text, was in fact writing for Peter, and simply using Peter's ideas and writing them in his own more educated and more advanced words. If Peter wrote this text, we call this Petrine, just like we have Johannine, meaning it's written by John, or Pauline, meaning written by Paul. If Peter wrote this text, we are looking at a composition date around 63 to 64 CE, sometime before his death. If inauthentic, we're probably looking at the 90s CE, and this is based on the Domitian persecution happening around 81, and then being cited later by other early Christians. The first epistle of Peter seems to be addressed primarily to Gentile Christians who are living around Asia Minor. These are to various churches, not anything in particular that we've seen in Paul's letters, and we do see that the Christians here are being persecuted. Therefore, the author's intent in this epistle is to address this persecution and explain to these Gentile Christians that persecution is happening or is about to happen in various places around Asia Minor, so they need to be aware of this. And second is to call these Gentile Christians to faithfulness in the message that Peter is preaching and in the gospel in this time of persecution. The second epistle of Peter is perhaps even more highly contested than the first epistle. Again, we ask whether Peter wrote this text or not. Most scholars note that not only does the author of this text not appear to be Peter, the apostle and the disciple of Christ, but not even the same author as the first epistle of Peter. Again, some scholars who believe that Peter wrote both this text and the first epistle might note that Silvanus perhaps was writing the first epistle while Peter himself was writing this one. Of course, like most texts, our understanding of the authorship of the second epistle of Peter is inconclusive, but most scholars claim that Peter did not in fact write this text. Because of this, it's usually dated to the late 1st to early 2nd century CE. More than likely, this is the latest New Testament writing that we have. This epistle is generally addressed to Christians and church. There's not anybody in particular who's addressed. The intent, like many other texts, is on discussing false teachings and pushing back against some of these. The author is not specific about what false teachings, but simply warns the people he is writing to be careful not to be led astray by false prophets, because God punishes even the angels who follow false teachings. The other intention is to portray a final testament of Peter, Again, whether this is Peter himself writing or somebody later writing in Peter's name, which would be common in this time, the intention is to show some kind of final testament that is either a fictional or a historical interpretation of what Peter would have wanted his followers to know before his death. Now that we've reached the end of this video, you should be able to explain the authorship, composition date, audience, and authorial intent of the epistles of Peter, describe the historical setting and context of the epistles, and identify themes in the epistles and give examples of how they are used in the text.